皆様、こんにちは。お待たせいたしました。ただいまから広島大学知のフォーラム、広島大学から世界へ、世界のトップ研究者に聞く第5弾を開催いたします。進行は私、広島大学理事副学長田中純子が務めさせていただきます。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本日はハーベイ・ジェームス・オルター博士をお迎えし、講演と座談会を行います。今回のフォーラムは新型コロナウイルス感染対策としてオンラインによる開催となっております。登壇者の皆様と登壇者の現地との時差などにより、事前収録による録画配信のパートもあることもご了承ください。なお、Zoom により参加されている皆様には、日本語のほか、英語による同時通訳も配信しております。Zoom の画面下にある翻訳ボタンにより切り替えてお聞きくださるようお願いいたします。それではまず、広島大学長、越智光雄よりご挨拶をさせていただきます。
皆さん、こんにちは。広島大学長の越智でございます。本日は広島大学知のフォーラム、広島大学から世界へ、世界のトップ研究者に聞く第5弾にご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。大会にあたり、広島大学を代表して一言ご挨拶申し上げます。本日は2020年ノーベル生理学・医学賞を受賞されたアメリカ国立衛生研究所の名誉研究員で、広島大学特別栄誉教授でもありますハーヴェイ・オルター博士にご講演をいただきます。はじめに、オルター博士のご紹介を簡単にさせていただきます。オルター博士は、輸血後に肝炎になった患者さんの中に、A 型でも B 型でもない人が多数いることに気づき、新たなウイルスの存在を突き止められました。このウイルスは後に C 型肝炎ウイルスと命名され、この発見は高感度の C 型肝炎ウイルス検査の開発につながり、輸血による感染を大きく減らすことができました。また、C 型肝炎ウイルスに対する抗ウイルス薬の開発も急速に進み、薬を飲むことで C 型肝炎を治療できるようになりました。この度の講演は、本学の理事副学長である田中純子先生がオルター博士にお声掛けして実現をいたしました。田中先生は疫学、疾病制御学が専門で、研究内容がオルター博士と非常に近く、国際会議などでオルター博士との議論に加わっていたと聞いております。また、私ども広島大学における世界トップレベルの研究拠点の一つである肝臓消化器研究拠点では最先端の研究を進めており、画期的な肝炎の治療法の開発を目指して着実に成果を上げております。そうした点でもオルター博士と広島大学の縁を感じているところです。本日はコロナ禍にあり、オルター博士に広島の地に直接お越しいただくことが難しく、またアメリカとの時差があることから、事前収録による開催となりました。オルター博士のご講演の後は、肝炎研究の最先端で活躍する本学の研究者とオルター博士との座談会をご準備させていただいておりますので、皆様お楽しみにしていてください。最後になりますが、広島大学は世界最初の被爆地である広島の地に開学した大学として、平和な国際社会の構築に貢献するとともに、100年後にも世界で光り輝く大学を目指しており、広島大学知のフォーラムもその取り組みの一つであります。本日の講演会が皆様にとって実り多いものとなりますよう記念いたしまして、私からのご挨拶とさせていただきます。どうもありがとうございました。
はい、ありがとうございました。では、オルタ博士のご紹介に続き、講演会を開始したいと思います。 Good morning, Dr. Orta. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this 5th Hiroshima University lecture meeting hosted by Hiroshima University. I am Junko Tanaka, Vice President in Hiroshima University. Hiroshima University holds this special lecture meeting called From Hiroshima to the World, inviting Nobel laureates and world-leading scientists regularly to provide valuable opportunities for students and young researchers to feel close to findings and studies that impacted the world. This year, President Ochi invited one of the Nobel laureates in physiology and medicine in 2020. Dr. Haarve James Orta, and he's kindly accepted our invitation, and we really appreciate it. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Orta to you. Dr. Orta is a medical researcher, biologist, and physician, and is a distinguished NIS scientist emeritus, Department of Transfusion Medicine. I was the second generation of the non-B hepatitis research group in Japan, and I was known Dr. Haarve Orta's activities for a long time through especially attending meetings of the International Plasma and Fractionation Association, IPFA, an international group related WHO on the safety of blood for transfusion. It is a great honor to hear that Dr. Haarve Orta has been familiar with my epidemiological studies of viral hepatitis, including work of my former supervisor, Professor Hiroshi Yoshizawa. Dr. Orta and his colleagues discovered a new virus previously called non-B hepatitis virus and later named as hepatitis C virus. This hepatitis C virus is not only the cause of post-transfusion hepatitis, but also the main cause of liver cancer. The discovery of the virus accelerated the development of screening and treatment. 30 years after this discovery, hepatitis C infection is now considered for elimination by the World Health Organization. Such advance in only 30 years from the discovery of the virus to hope for elimination is exceptional. The findings was praised at the Nobel Award ceremony as saving millions of lives. Congratulations on this achievement. We are really proud of your success. Today, Dr. Orta will give a special lecture and share his research life, experience, and work. I believe that his lecture will inspire our ideas and life. Now, I cordially would like to ask Dr. Orta to start this special lecture. Dr. Orta, please.
Thank you, Junko, and it's a great pleasure to be here. This title slide of my talk, Hepatitis C, the end of the beginning, perhaps the beginning of the end, is actually exactly what I'm going to talk about. We are at the end of the beginning and hopefully at the beginning of the end. This is life in the time of COVID. And I'm so sorry that COVID is preventing me from being in Hiroshima at this time. I've been to Japan many times and kind of consider it my second home. I've been honored and privileged to have fellows and collaborators from all over Japan, but particularly Sendai, Matsumoto, Nagoya, Tokyo, and Hiroshima. All have been excellent, and many have become my good friends. I visited Hiroshima in the past and had a memorable and moving experience in your city. At this time, I'm particularly honored that Professor Ochi has conferred on me the title of Honorary Professor of Hiroshima University. I'm very proud of that. So to begin, after my Nobel Award, I received this congratulatory card that I thought was very prophetic. And probably if there's anything I want to convey today, it is a message on this card. Namely, that there is no elevator to success. You have to take the stairs. What I want to do in my lecture today is take you step by step through the discovery of hepatitis C through parts of my life. Actually, hepatitis has been with us for a long time. As far as we know, it began with Hippocrates in 400 BC. Hippocrates was a great observer. He was a physician and a philosopher, and he observed people who were becoming yellow that he termed icterus, and other people who had hardening of the liver that he termed chiros. Hippocrates is the father of medicine, and he had the theory that disease was due to an imbalance of the four humors. In this case, an imbalance of an excess of bile. While this did not hold up to peer review in subsequent generations, Hippocrates made the key observation that disease was not divine punishment, but rather it was due to some external force that was perturbing these four humors in the body. He didn't know about viruses, he didn't know about infections, but he knew that something was coming from the outside and it was disturbing the body. This was indeed profound. Nothing much happened over the next 2,000 years, except that there were many wars. And during each war, many combatants came down with yellow skin and the symptoms of hepatitis. Eventually, in World War II, this got distinguished epidemiologically as infectious and serum hepatitis, hepatitis A and B. But through those 2,000 years, there was no test for any hepatitis agent and no great insights into its causation. The breakthrough came in early 1960s when I had the privilege of working with Dr. Bloomberg, and we observed this line in agar reaction between a patient who was multiply transfused and an Australian Aborigine who just happened by chance to be tested on that particular day. I'm not going to go into the hepatitis B story, but it's fascinating and was the basis for the Nobel Prize for Dr. Bloomberg in 1976. What I wanted to start with in my step-by-step story is we began in late 1960s with Dr. Robert Purcell, Dr. Paul Holland, and Dr. Paul Schmidt to establish a prospective study of patients undergoing open heart surgery. We chose that population because these patients received a lot of blood and because they were not immunodeficient and therefore would presumably develop antibodies. The heart-lung machine at that time required 7 units of blood just to prime the machines. Everybody got a lot of blood, on an average about 17 units each. The key was this was a prospective study. We sampled patients before transfusion and every 1 to 2 weeks post-transfusion, froze these samples away, and also saved the donor samples where we could. The only way we could establish hepatitis was to measure the ALT, or what's called then the SGPT, and shortly thereafter, we had the first generation test for hepatitis B. The first finding was the inordinately high rate of post-transfusion hepatitis. exceeding 30% in our population, in this heavily transfused population. Became clear from a study by John Walsh that the main reason for this high rate of hepatitis was the source of blood. If you received at least 1 unit of blood from a patient who, from a paid donor, from a commercial blood donor, you had a 51% chance of getting hepatitis. Whereas if you received only volunteer donor blood, the risk was only 7%. Therefore, in 1970, we were able to transfer to an all volunteer donor system and also introduce the first generation test for hepatitis B. This caused a precipitous drop in hepatitis incidence from over 30% down to about 10%. And nothing we've ever done since that time has been as impactful because our rates have never been so high. In 1973, Abbott Laboratories developed a more sensitive assay for hepatitis B. And we went back to these stored samples and tested them all for hepatitis B and found that only 25% of the cases were actually due to B and that there was some other non-B entity. In 1975, Feinstein, shown on your right, Kapickian and Purcell, using immune electron microscopy, discovered the hepatitis A virus. These investigators were on the campus and we were collaborating with them. And I sent all the non-B cases to Steve Feinstein. And it turned out that not a single case was due to the hepatitis A virus. Therefore, in a brilliant jump of logic, we said if these cases were not A and were not B, we would call them non-A, non-B. Now we used this very awkward nomenclature because we hadn't yet proven that this was a viral agent and we hadn't seen the agent, we didn't have any tests for it. We didn't know how many agents there might be. So we called it non-A, non-B rather than hepatitis C at that time. The next step in this progression was the invaluable chimpanzee model. We're no longer allowed to use chimps, but they were not harmed in these studies. In fact, they loved being in them, and you can see them here lining up for their informed consent. What we found was that we could transmit hepatitis based on ALT elevations from patients who had either acute or chronic non-A, non-B hepatitis, or from totally asymptomatic blood donors who had been implicated in hepatitis transmission. The next important step, I just want to stop here to tell you, because I'm a government worker, and the US government workers sometimes are considered to be lazy and just living off the government dole. I want you to know that I, at least, have always given 100% at work. It's just that it has this peculiar distribution. So today in the US is, I think Wednesday is one of my better days. In any event, the next big event was finding this patient, known around the world now as Mr. H. Mr. H was liked to climb mountains and to blaze trails. And one day while up on a mountain, he had a cardiac arrest. Fortunately, his wife was with him, was able to administer CPR and to resuscitate him. Eventually made his way to NIH and was enrolled in our study before he had open heart surgery. He required a triple coronary bypass. Shown here in this slide on your left is in blue are the ALT elevations. And you see that at week 5, his ALT levels began to rise, reaching a peak at point B of 2,112. Fortunately, at point A, we obtained a plasmapheresis unit and inoculated a small volume of that unit, just 1 ml, into a chimpanzee. And that, shown in the upper right-hand panel, caused hepatitis in the chimp. Bob Purcell then did titers, infectivity titers, in additional chimpanzees, and showed that Mr. H had an infectivity titer of 1 × 10⁶.5 chimp infectious doses at point A, the peak of his, later we know the peak of his HCV RNA. At point B, at the peak of the ALT, we inoculated into a second chimpanzee, and this did not cause hepatitis. And we wondered why, but we think now, when we were able to go back and do HCV RNA on these stored samples, you can see that right after transfusion, there was a small blip in HCV RNA. This was the donor virus coming into the patient. It was then contained, but then another variant rose up and caused the main hepatitis. So one reason was that was not infectious at point B was that the HCV RNA was rapidly falling at that point. And also the antibody had developed so that most of the virus was now immune complex, as shown on the lower right panel, but we don't have to go into that. But we now had 2 things. We had this infectious titered inoculum. By the way, the titer by HCV RNA by PCR was 3 × 10⁶, almost identical to the chimp infectivity titer. So we now had this titered inoculum, and we had the chimpanzee model. This allowed Steve Feinstone to do this important experiment where he did a chloroform extraction of the H inoculum, and shown that after chloroform, the material was no longer infectious, whereas after a sham extraction, the chimp got hepatitis. So this said that there was a central lipid in the envelope of this non-A, non-B agent, which helped to classify it, as we'll see in a moment. We then did filtration studies, and by taking the filtrates and inoculating those filtrates into a chimpanzee, we could tell where viral infectivity stopped. And we knew the virus then was somewhere between 30 and 60 nanometers. Thus, we could hypothesize that the non-A, non-B agent was a small lipid encapsulated agent of about 30 to 60 nanometers. This narrowed down the viral class to being either one of the small RNA viruses, the alpha or flaviviruses at that time, to being in the hepatina hepatitis B group DNA viruses or the delta agent, but we had a lot of evidence that this was not related to hepatitis B. So it was going to be either a new viral class or one of these small RNA agents. It was Dan Bradley at the CDC who first said this was most compatible with non-A, non-B being a flavivirus, as it eventually turned out to be. Now, we kept trying to find a specific assay for the virus, but were unsuccessful for many, many, many years. But during that time, we were able to look at the clinical consequences of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which many thought were just a benign transaminitis. With the liver unit at NIH, we did initial biopsies in 39 patients. And you see that most of them had very mild disease, but 10% already had cirrhosis, and 13% had what was called chronic active hepatitis, which might progress to cirrhosis. We then did repeat biopsies at varying intervals and showed that while most patients were stable or even improved over time, that another 25% went on to develop cirrhosis. Thus, we had 8 out of the 39 patients, or 20%, who evolved from non-A, non-B hepatitis into cirrhosis, a number which is really held up over the decades. It's somewhere between 20 and 30%. But we also found that 3 of these patients died of liver failure, 3 others had severe liver disease when they died of their underlying heart disease. So we now knew that we had a serious progressive disease that could lead to cirrhosis and liver-related death. So we kept looking for this test. So we tried everything: serologic, enzymatic, radioimmunologic, early molecular biology, and still could not elucidate the agent. It was that time that I wrote this poem of frustration called "I Can't See the Forest for the HBAGs." I think that I shall never see this virus called non-A, non-B, a virus I cannot deliver, and yet I know it's in the liver. A virus that we often blame, but which exists alone by name. No antigen or DNA, a little test to mark its way. A virus which in our confusion has forced us into mass collusion to make exist just by exclusion. But is it real or an illusion? Oh, great liver in the sky, show us where and tell us why. Send us thoughts that will inspire us. Let us see this elusive virus. If we don't publish soon, they're going to fire us. Well, this poem presented at a national meeting, I think, was the impetus for the Chiron Corporation to clone the non-A, non-B agent. But shortly thereafter, Michael Houghton and his group at Chiron took serum from infected chimps from the CDC and from some human patients. They pelleted the serum or the plasma, then took the pellet, extracted the RNA, reverse transcribed the RNA into cDNA, cut that up with restriction enzymes, and then importantly used a newly discovered FOS GT11 expression vector, which when it infected E. coli would not only carry the genetic information, but would express any protein that was coded by that gene. The E. coli then grew an agar and were then lysed and absorbed onto filter paper. And the third important step, Michael Houghton said, there must be an antibody in patients who had chronic non-A, non-B or convalesced from non-A, non-B. And so he screened these filter papers with what he hoped would be an antibody. The story goes that they screened 6 million clones before a single clone was found to be positive with this antibody. But then they were able to subclone this, to re-express the protein, to walk the genome and develop a small antigenic sequence, and thus develop an antibody assay. Immediately, this is a picture on your left of Dan Bradley at the CDC, who was working in parallel, but not with us, but he was working with Chiron. And on the right is Michael Houghton. At the time, he received the Lasker Award and later also shared the Nobel Prize. The first thing that Chiron did when they thought they had an assay, antibody assay for non-A, non-B, was to request a panel I had developed, a non-A, non-B panel. This was a small panel, but it was very tricky in that every sample in the panel was pedigreed, either proven to be infectious in a chimpanzee model or proven not to be infectious because it came from blood donors who had donated more than 10 times and never transmitted hepatitis. Every sample in the panel was there in duplicate, and every duplicate was in a random position. 19 other laboratories who claimed to have a non-A, non-B assay failed this panel, but Chiron hit it on the head. They found that 3 patients with chronic non-A, non-B hepatitis were positive in 6 different samples, random positions. They also found 2 implicated donors to be positive in 4 different positions in the panel. They did not pick up the 2 acute cases of hepatitis non-A, non-B because they were looking for an antibody, not for a virus. But these patients later seroconverted for antibody. And importantly, they did not find the agent in 7 control samples in 14 different positions. So they scored 100% on this panel. And then I used their assay to look at 15 of our best non-A, non-B cases. And in 100%, the patients were negative for hepatitis C before transfusion and then positive post-transfusion. We then looked at the donors to 25 non-A, non-B cases. We found a positive donor in 80% by a first-generation assay and 88% by a second-generation assay. So we presume that if we introduce this test into blood donor screening, we might prevent near 90% of residual post-transfusion hepatitis. And indeed, that's what happened. I showed you the beginning of this slide earlier. We tried other interventions over the years, and this did decrease the incidence of post-transfusion hepatitis, particularly the introduction of anti-hepatitis B core antibody as a surrogate marker in 1987. But then by 1990, our rates had fallen to 4.1%. The use of blood had diminished from 17 units to about 8 units. And we introduced the first generation test for HCV. This brought the incidence down to 1.1% with only 1 case of non-A, non-B hepatitis C. A second generation test was introduced in 1992. There were no longer any cases of non-A, non-B. And by 1997, we had reached 0 incidence. This is not true zero because this is just a small prospective study. But it's now estimated that the risk of hepatitis C from blood transfusion is about 1 in 2 million. So we came from 1 in 3 prior to 1970 down to 1 in 2 million by 1997. It's estimated that in the US alone, transfusion may have transmitted almost 5 million HCV infections in the 2 decades from 1970 to 1990. In contrast, HCV testing probably prevented another 2.4 million transmissions in the next 2 decades from 1990 to 2010. Now, this is that same slide, just with this big downward arrow, just to show that this is not only the story of post-transfusion hepatitis, this is the story of my life. And you can see both transfusion hepatitis and my life are on this very steep decline. But I'm happy to say that hepatitis has reached near 0, and I'm still here talking about it. So I'm going to switch gears now because we have, with that slide, reached the end of the beginning, the elimination of post-transfusion hepatitis, discovery of hepatitis C, great assays for that agent. Excuse me. This slide, you can see that hepatitis C is a worldwide problem. As we know, about 70 million chronic carriers, about 5 million of those in the US. But the point is that this virus is highly persistent. So 75 to 85% who develop hepatitis C become chronic carriers. And we were interested in seeing why that was true. In work with Patricia Farsi at NIH, we took Mr. H's sample, and Patricia looked at 105 clones from the hypervariable region of the envelope and found that while 57% of the clones were dominant, that a single clone was dominant, there were also 19 other clones present simultaneously. So that even if one developed a good antibody against the dominant clone, any one of these other agents already present could emerge and take over dominance and persist the infection. Another study to show that, again done with Patricia Farsi, looked at 4 different time points along the ALT curve. and showed and did 10 clones at each of these points. Found that at week 3, there were sort of 3 co-equal members of the quasi-species arbitrarily labeled A, B, and C. That by week 8 now, D had become the dominant strain, but there was also E, F, and G. That by week 13, you can see the A was still present, but no longer dominant. There's also HRJK elemental P. And by week 16, continued evolution all the way up to the letter U. So this is the evolution of the viral quasi-species. Any one of these variants is already present and can become the dominant strain. So this quasi-species nature of hepatitis C is a key reason why it's so difficult to develop a vaccine for this virus, and a key reason why it is persistent, a persistent agent. Another reason is that the immune responses, the T cell responses, are important, and shown here in the study by Wertheimer, not in my laboratory. If you look at patients who have recovered from hepatitis C, they have good T cell responses by the ELISpot assay, both CD4 and CD8. But if you are chronically infected, these responses are not detectable. No different from a normal person who does not have hepatitis C. So what we know now is that the viral load somehow blunts the CD4 and CD8 responses. It doesn't eradicate them, because once they recover, these responses come back. In looking at the clinical aspects of hepatitis non-A, non-B, or C, we found 3 major patterns. Most patients have this very stable or very slowly progressive disease where they persistently HCV RNA positive, but they had very low level ALT elevations, and they could go on for so often their entire life when they died of something else. But 20 to 30% had severe and progressive fibrosis, where they eventuated into cirrhosis in 15 to 40 years. And in a 5%, less than 5% had this rapid course where they could develop cirrhosis in 5 to 10 years. We now think that these patients probably had coexistent NASH or unexplained or alcoholic hepatitis. But the main group we deal with now is this middle group, this 20 to 30%. To show you the difference between those who had slow progression and rapid progression, Patricia Farsi did this additional study where the slow progressors, shown in yellow, you see early on had that rise or initial infection, but then would contain that infection and almost eradicate the virus, but not quite. And then a new variant would emerge to give you chronic hepatitis C. In contrast, those who had rapid progression never had this early immune containment. They stayed with high levels of HCV RNA from the beginning throughout their course. The rapid progressors also were found to have high levels of MCP1, or monocyte chemotactic protein. This is a pro-fibrogenic chemokine that attracts stellate cells and then is again produced by the stellate cells, setting up the cycle of stellate cell activation, MCP1 production, and collagen deposition, leading to progressive fibrosis. In contrast, the slow progressors have increased levels of interferon gamma and MIP1 beta, and these are the good cytokines that diminish inflammation. I want to show you one study relating to hepatocellular carcinoma, study we did with Yasu Tanaka in Nagoya and Dr. Mizukami who at that time was in Nagoya also. These two investigators are experts in molecular clock analyses. They looked at the predominant genotype in Japan, genotype 1B, compared that with the US genotype 1A. And what the molecular clock does, it allows you to look at when a particular genotype emerged from a common ancestor, and then what is spread within a given population. Well, you can see in Japan, genotype 1B first emerged in 1880 and was quite stable until the 1930s and 1940s when it began to rise precipitously. Well, we know that Japan in the 1930s and 40s was at war, and we're learning now that maybe the cause of spread of hepatitis C was the use of amphetamines by soldiers going into battle and sharing needles. In the US, in contrast, the genotype 1A diverged in 1910, then was stable until the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when we had our own needle sharing epidemic, which now persists. Interestingly, the epidemic in the US continues, whereas in Japan it is tapering off because this cohort that was infected is now disappearing with age. The important point of this slide was there's a 30 to 40 year difference in these two curves. And investigators in Japan have always said, well, the important point is that the rates of hepatocellular carcinoma in Japan are 8 to 10-fold higher than those in the US. And Japanese investigators always said, it's just because we've had this virus longer than you have, and you'll see that with time, your rates of hepatocellular carcinoma will also increase. Well, that's what's happening. In this study by El Sarag at Baylor, you can see that if you compare late 1970s with late 1990s, there's been a 3-fold increase in the rates of hepatocellular carcinoma, age-adjusted rates in the US. That this is all due to hepatitis C, not to B or other causes. It was said in 2009 that if there's no change in the standards of care, that the total number of patients with advanced liver disease and hepatocellular carcinoma would increase by 4-fold. Important, the key statement is assuming no change in the standards of care. Fortunately, there has been a major change in the standard of care. We now have these wonderful direct-acting antivirals, which have cure rates of 95 to 98%, in many studies 100%. So we can now cure virtually everybody with hepatitis C and prevent this progression. So how you look at hepatitis C is kind of whether you see the glass as half full or half empty. If you see the glass as half full, you can say that with cure rates now approaching 100%, from this time forward, once HCV infection is identified, no one should develop cirrhosis or die from hepatitis C sequelae. But if you see the glass as half empty, you realize there's still hurdles to HCV eradication. First is that it's estimated that only 50% of cases have been identified. It's probably even lower if you go throughout the world. Many people with hepatitis C remain unidentified. So that's one thing. Next is the access to treatment, because even among known carriers early on, only the minority were able to get treated with these DAAs. The proportion has greatly increased over time. And lastly, it was the cost. The drugs were incredibly expensive. This was a big impediment to treatment. It still is an impediment in the developing world. But we have the means. We have the drugs that can cure. So cure is no longer a matter constrained by science. It's a matter of dollars and the will to make it happen. So we can consider, can HBV and HCV actually be eradicated? Well, with HBV, the course is clear. We have a very good vaccine. that can prevent this infection, prevent the sequelae of hepatitis B. We also have nucleotide and nucleoside inhibitors that can bring the viral load below detectable and therefore prevent transmission. So B is a matter of getting a vaccine out there to more and more people. To eradicate hepatitis C is more difficult. We sort of need a little miracle. But there are elements of this miracle that are can be tackled. We talked about B, but what we have to do is we have to detect these large numbers, these millions of people of HCV carriers who don't know they have HCV. We have to do this through massive global screening with tests that are inexpensive and can be used in the field. Then we have to give these drugs, and I envision that we would test the patient in the office or in the field, and immediately, if they're positive, using these rapid tests, immediately give them the first month or 2 months supply of the medication. Need to penetrate the population probably by 90% to get eradication. So what we need now for this miracle is the political, the corporate, the philanthropic, and the moral will to make it happen. I think it will happen. If we get a vaccine for C, that will speed things up. But even with a vaccine, we have to go country by country and do this massive screening and massive treatment. It's going to take decades. It won't happen under my watch because I have a new philosophy, a new philosophic perspective on life. Here, where I plotted age on the abscissa against give a damn on the ordinate. This is me out here. So I'm at the end of the line, but it's you investigators, you young investigators in the audience who are going to take on this challenge and eradicate hepatitis C. So I'd like to end with a poem I wrote after receiving the Nobel Prize called I Never Had No Nobel Dreams. When I grew up in Ridgewood, Queens, I never had no Nobel dreams. My goal was to hit the ball between the seams, perhaps be a hero on one of my teams, to not have my mom detect my schemes. High school was unauspicious. I mixed with the mob, did nothing suspicious. I was small for my age and basically shy. Could have been a model for Catcher in the Rye. I was not voted most likely to succeed, but there was that my hair would recede. When I graduated high school, I gave no speeches. There was no sign that one day my deeds would exceed those of my teachers. Nothing about me was the fodder for memes. And certainly, I never had no Nobel dreams. In my 20s, I was in medical school, reading textbooks by the reams, studying cadavers splayed at the seams. From massive text, I was sucking the nectars, studying all night and sleeping through lectures. At Rochester Med, great teachers abounded. Everything was interesting. My career choices compounded. But of Nobel thoughts, I had noughts. Then came marriage and baby screams, my first house secure in its beams. I was ready to take on whatever life deems. Children growing, my career flowing, lots of patience, lots of teaching. Deep research seemed beyond my reaching. Nobel aspirations, no one was preaching. That an Aboriginal antigen I had observed in my youth was linked to hepatitis B by Blumberg the sleuth. Of hepatitis viruses, we were discerning the truth. For me, a chance to return to my NIH roots. Non-A, non-B arose from long prospective studies. I tracked this agent along with bright NIH buddies. And with Chiron's cloning of C, they came the safest of bloodies. With this, my career advanced, but Nobel dreams I never chanced. And now my non-Nobel dream has unfolded. With new credentials, I'm suddenly emboldened. 1,000 congratulatory emails my computer uploaded. But from Nobel aspirations, I was not truly molded. I expect any day the Karolinska will have unmolded. And I will be the first laureate to have his medal ungolded. Have the King of Sweden say, from Malta we must hold it. Get the medal back before he has sold it. This award has given my life a massive shakeup. My heart and my mind are having a breakup. Strange forces are scrambling my genetic makeup. Though the leaves of my life, age will soon rake up. I'm happy to be where I am, because in life there's no makeup. From this Nobel dream, I'm afraid to wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ota. So it is very impressive and memorable. So especially for it is very beautiful poem. So the last you talk about your life and beautiful, it was very beautiful to listen. And your presentation make me back in 30 years ago, just after the discovery of hepatitis C virus. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much, Dr. Ota, for your amazing lecture on the pioneering finding on the hepatitis C and your continuous study on this subject. So I'm Manabu Abe. I'm not the physiologist, but the organic chemist and vice president for research at Hiroshima University. So I will be moderating this roundtable discussion with Professor Altar. Can I have this discussion time with our panelists? So first, let me introduce today's panelists. They are Professor Chayama, Professor Tanaka, and Professor Odan from the Graduate School of Biomedical and Health Science, Hiroshima University. They are all specialists in the study of the liver. So I would like to ask our professors to introduce yourself. First, Professor Chayama, please.
Good morning, Dr. Ota. My name is Kazaki Chayama. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to meet a renowned scientist like you. I have been a professor of Hiroshima University for over 20 years, conducting clinical and research on hepatitis C. As you probably do not remember, I actually sent you an email about 12 years ago, asking you to give a lecture in Hiroshima. This is because the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology of Japan, next Japan, has solicited a program to fund the recruitment of Nobel Prize class scientists. So I decided to invite you. You couldn't come to Hiroshima due to the tight schedule. But if you were in Hiroshima at that time, I must have been honored to have spotted and invite a Nobel Prize scientist. I'm very grateful to be able to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kazi.
Thank you.
So next, Professor Odan, please.
I did make it to Hiroshima.
Thank you very much, Professor Gastroenterological Transplantation Surgery. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude and excitement for your wonderful lectures. As a liver surgeon, I'm very honored to have privilege asking you questions. I'm liver transplantation surgeries. I have witnessed the advance in HCV treatment that cured, saved many patients who need liver active and safe DAA and increased HCV treatment in post-transplantation setting. Now people are interested in the transplantation of HCV viremic organ in HCV negative patient. I think that that's increase the transplantation rate and probably decrease the wait list mortalities. But intentionally transmitting infectious disease in a patient probably have practical and ethical implications. So may I ask Professor Alter, what's your thought of that HCV viremic organ transplantation in HCV negative patient?
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing to even think that we would consider doing that. Before the direct acting antivirals, you of course would screen the liver donors for hepatitis C, and if they were positive, you would not use them. And now to think that we have drugs that are so good that you can be confident that you can infect the patient almost purposely and know that you're going to cure them in 8 weeks or 12 weeks, it's just remarkable. I think this is now accepted practice here in the US as well as in Japan and other places. I think it's a great advance. It has shortened the wait list. And transplant has been a great bridge to saving many lives, people who would have died of hepatitis C, now living with new organs. So I congratulate you on that.
Thank you very much. I think we would like to start the practice of that use of HCV viremic organ. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Professor Tanaka.
Yeah. So now, I'm now is a professor of the epidemiology and the infectious disease and control in Hiroshima University. So I'd like to say about the post-transfusion hepatitis C in Japan. Since 2013, we cannot see any case in whole Japan after the transfusion. So more than 9 years, so we don't see any case in post-transfusion hepatitis C. So it is very remarkable progress in hepatitis C infections. So I'd like to talk about this issue to you. And is there any questions? So,
are there any questions from the?
Questions?
Can I comment on that, Junko?
Yeah.
You know, going way back to the Bloomberg days.
Yeah.
Dr. Bloomberg worked very early on with investigators in Japan and the first use of hepatitis B surface antigen, then called the Australia antigen. And I remember that was with Dr. Oda's group, and Dr. Okochi was, Okochi was his main collaborator. And then I had many interactions with Dr. Nishioka.
Yeah.
And he was sort of the transfusion expert in those days. And so Japan was right at the forefront of hepatitis B testing. And of course, it stayed on with hepatitis C testing. So yes, it's been a great thing. And it goes back to the 1960s. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Professor
So
Chayama?
are there any questions? Additional questions? Chayama sensei?
Okay.
Yeah.
May I
Thank you.
ask, the panel you created played a great role in the discovery and kit development of hepatitis C virus. I'd like to ask you, why did you decide to create such a panel? And how the panel actually played a role in the first discovery cloning of the virus by Chiron researchers?
Yeah, well, it was clear back in this, we first found 999B in 1975. And when we called it 999B, I gave you the reasons. We didn't know it was a virus. We didn't know how many viruses it might be. But we were very confident that we would soon find an assay, find a test for it. But obviously we did not. It proved to be extremely hard. There wasn't that much antigen present, and there wasn't a way to detect antibodies without an antigen. And molecular biology was not yet a science. So people would come up with various things that they thought would detect 999B, and nobody knew whether these were real or valid or not. So that was the impetus for developing the panel. And fortunately, we had all these chimp experiments, so we knew which samples were infectious. And I was in a blood bank, so I could select the donors who'd given over and over and over again and never been implicated in a hepatitis case, because we tracked all the hepatitis cases. I didn't know the panel would have play such a big role, but it was a way for people to then request the panel. And nobody could break the code over many, many years. Particularly, they failed because the duplicates were there and because they were in very random positions. The panel was very tricky. And mostly they failed. They would find whatever they were looking for in the control samples. And that was the way most of the tests failed. So in fact, when Chiron asked for the panel, and I sent it to them, and then they sent me the results the next day, I didn't even look at them because I wasn't expecting a positive result. And I'd seen so much failure. And so they kept calling me to look at give them the results. So I finally did break the code, and they did so well on it. So, but we just needed some way to evaluate these many assays that proved to be false assays.
I think that's great that in the absence of molecular biology, you created a very robust panel. So it's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So you showed that the mortality of liver cancer in United States is still increasing. Maybe you said in your presentations. So, and also you showed the time difference of the prevalence of hepatitis C in Japan and in United States is some kind of so-called time difference, 20 years or some others. So in Japan, and the mortality of liver cancer peaked out at 2002. So now we have the mortality of liver cancer is now decreasing. So my question is, in United States, the mortality of liver cancer is still increasing. Is it not peak out? What do you think about your estimations?
I don't have the numbers. I have the studies by Dr. El Sarag that show the increase prior to direct-acting antivirals, but I'm sure the rates are coming down. The only reason why anybody would progress now to cirrhosis and cancer is that they haven't been identified as having hepatitis C, or they haven't had access to the drugs. So I think the rates will continue to come down as we cure more and more people. In my own small study of HCV positive blood donors, we've had a few deaths from hepatocellular carcinoma out of, let's say, about 200 people. But almost everybody else has been cured now. It's incredible to see this cohort where virtually everybody has been cured if they got the treatment. So it's a very wonderful time, and I really do think if we could really get a good rapid test and the price of drugs drop down, that you could go country by country and eradicate hepatitis C. And Egypt, that had the highest rates of hepatitis C, has virtually eliminated that virus now. Just by that method, test and treat. And Brazil is trying to do that now, and there are many task forces that are fostering this kind of country by country eradication. It's a hard process. It's very labor intensive and costly, but it can be done if you have the will. And treating hepatitis C, as expensive as it was, has been shown to be cost effective, because the cost of liver transplantation and the cost of treating a patient with cirrhosis is exceedingly high. So we want to put Dr. Odan out of business by not having any more end-stage liver disease from hepatitis C.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions? It's okay. So, Dr. Alta, although the time is limited, but I have several questions to you. From the question is coming from the young scientist. Could you accept our question to you?
Sure, yes.
Thank you very much.
I used to be a young scientist.
Thank you very much. So I selected about 5 questions from many questions from young scientists. So first one is, what do you think is important for a researcher? This is very simple but a difficult question.
Yeah, well, for a young researcher, there are many elements that are important. I think it's a tough road, truthfully, to be successful in research, but it's so worth it. It's so exciting along the way, even if you don't reach the ultimate end point. The journey is exciting, and the life you'll have will be continually interesting. But what I recommend is that you first find a good, if you want research, you have to find the right mentor. It's hard to go in from the beginning and have a great project. So the easiest route is to find a good mentor who will not only use your hands, but try to foster your career. The second thing is, once you're within a laboratory, try to find your own niche. You can start out with the project that the mentor assigned you, but try to become an expert in some particular area. One of the problems with being young in research is that you tend to jump around from lab to lab, and then you get into different projects. But as much as you can, try to focus so that you become an expert, because collaboration is the most important thing. In science today, you can't do things alone. So you have to collaborate not only with your mentor, but with as many people as you can, because every collaborator teaches you something and they become your mentors as well. So try to find your own niche so that you become somebody who has a particular skill set, a particular patient cohort, a particular sample collection, a particular assay that you've developed, something that will make people want to work with you, and broaden your collaborations. In those collaborations, you have to be collegial. My collaborators have become my friends, and we work together. We don't compete with each other. And so collaboration, good mentorship, finding the proper niche, and then you got to work hard. There's no getting away from this. Is a difficult endeavor. In Japan, I've never had a problem with people working hard. The fellows who come to my lab work incredibly hard, and they're all so bright and well trained. It's been a real pleasure to have fellows from Japan. So the last thing, the hard thing is how to have a life and do research at the same time. How to balance your research with your family, with spending time with your wife, spending time with your children. It's a very, very difficult balance, but it's so important. It's equally important to your research. And so be a good father, a good mother, and a good scientist.
Thank you very much. So the second question from young scientist is, what made you decide to make biology your lifelong research?
That's a complicated question, but it was really mostly chance. I came to NIH not because I wanted to be a researcher, but because I thought I might want to be an academician. And this was a very good stepping stone. And also at the time, it was a way to do military service, but not in the field, but do it in a great research hospital. So I got to NIH, and just by luck, my very first project wound up finding the Australia antigen, and got me into hepatitis and virology. But even with that, my plan was to go into practice, to go to clinical practice. Dr. Blumberg, when he left NIH, asked me to go with him to continue working on the Australia antigen. And somehow I was clear that I wanted to go into practice. So I finished my clinical training in medicine, came back to Georgetown as a hematology fellow, and then applied for a practice position in a very good group in Washington, and didn't get the job. And my boss said, well, you can always go to practice. Why don't you stay here at Georgetown? And so I went on the faculty at Georgetown, and then I got into academia, and then I didn't want to go into practice anymore. But there were two critical events, and neither one of which could have been predicted. If I had not been drafted into the Army and was able to go to NIH instead, I probably would not have been a researcher. I definitely would not have been a researcher. If I went into the Army, I would have been a clinician. Secondly, if I'd gotten that job that I wanted, I would have been in practice. But I didn't. And so life, you never know where your life's going to go. So when you're young, just keep your options open. But you have to be a little bit lucky. You have to be at the right place at the right time.
So nobody knows future. So the third question from the young scientist is that what books or people influenced you when you were a student?
Well, in retrospect, I had a wonderful biology teacher in high school that made biology my favorite subject. Medical school at University of Rochester was, loved it. Every topic was interesting. It made me think about being an academician, not at that time a researcher, but I did research as a student. Interesting, I won't go into the study, but tried to publish it even in the Rochester Journal, and it was not accepted, but the first of many rejections. But it gave me a little feel for research, and but NIH was the turning point. You know, getting into a place like NIH where science and research were priority one. That be an environment where you allowed time to do your research, where you had support. So find the best place for yourself if you can. But I wasn't, any science genius. My poem indicated I wasn't on a path to a Nobel Prize, and I wasn't any science genius or genius of any kind. But I worked hard, and you have to work hard, study hard.
Thank you very much. So the fourth question from the young scientist is, what were the times when you felt like you were going to fail in your research? What did you overcome it?
That's a very interesting question. Everybody does fail at some points, and things don't go right. But I was doing really clinical research, and clinical research is long and tedious. You don't get rapid answers, but you're likely to get some answer if you're following patients, because you're studying a disease, and you're likely to make some observations that could be important. If you're doing bench work, well, a lot of experiments are going to fail. And I learned from Dr. Bloomberg the power of persistence. He was a great hypothesizer, and he had this wall in his office where he would write down, this is my hypothesis. This is what I'm going to do to prove it. Then that fails. Okay, well, this is now my new hypothesis. And this is what I'm going to do to look at that. And he had this whole wall full of these things with many, many failures. But he kept at it. So the Australia antigen could have been easily dropped as just a finding. We had this antigen, and we don't know what it means. We thought at first, in fact, it might be related to leukemia, because it's prevalent in the leukemia population. But Bloomberg just kept at it until, a lot by chance, the link to hepatitis evolved. It's a very interesting story. So I learned from him to stick to it. So we did these long-term prospective studies, but we kept making, we didn't know where these were going. We were looking for what caused transfusion hepatitis and what could we do to reduce that rate, but had no idea that we weren't looking to discover a new virus. That came out of it, but that was not in the initial plan. We didn't know we would define a new disease. But you just keep at it, and along the way you make these interval observations and you publish those. I don't know what happened there. I lost the screen, but anyway, you make these interval observations and that keeps you going, and that tells you what to do next, and then you find something else that tells you what to do next. So you don't have to plan out your whole life, you just do it in steps. So remember my first slide, it's a step-by-step process.
Yeah, right. There is no elevator to success.
Yeah,
right?
no elevator. Right.
Yeah, that's good words. So the last question from the young science is going to the recent issue, coronavirus. So what do you think is most important issue to overcome the new coronavirus infections and how to solve it?
Yeah, well,
bad question, sorry, but
okay. Well, obviously I have no solution, but this is an infection that could have been stopped much earlier. If governments and people had done the right thing when the virus first came out, if people had done what was recommended, wearing masks and not being in groups and self-isolating, I think the epidemic could have been stopped even before we had any vaccines. But that didn't happen. And what's astounding to me is that people still, for reasons that are perplexing, refuse to wear masks and refuse to take vaccines, which are proven effective. A very big, in the US, a very large population refuses to do the right things, and that's keeping the infection going. So fortunately now more and more people are getting vaccinated. In the US, I don't know the status in Japan, but I know in Africa, it's still, the majority have not been vaccinated. So if we could really do universal vaccination, these messenger RNA vaccines are very good. If people would wear masks, and not congregate in bars and things like that, where transmission occurs. This Delta agent is highly infectious. So even if you've been vaccinated, you can get reinfected, but you don't go on to bad disease. So the answer is old science, epidemiologic science. Listen to the CDCs. Do what you're told. Take vaccines which are proven effective. That will end the infection. You reach herd immunity, but you need human compliance. So it's very frustrating the way it's rolled out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So finally, this is a request from me. Could you please have a short message to young researchers?
Well, I'm sorry, I've lost the screen here, but can you see me?
Yes, I can see you clearly.
Okay,
I can hear you clearly.
Okay. Well, I think I've given my message to young researchers. I think in life you want to have a job that you enjoy, a job that brings you gratification and is interesting. And And medicine, whether clinical or basic, is just intrinsically interesting. There are so many questions to be answered. There's so many questions that keep evolving. The more you learn, the more questions there are. There's so much technology which is allowing you to answer these questions. So it is a great field to be in. It'll give you a lifetime of satisfaction that you did something worthwhile. And so I would say pursue it. And you can do this in many fields, but to me, the medical fields, the science fields are the most interesting. So stay with it, work hard, get a good mentor, find your area of expertise and stick to it.
Right.
Collaborate and love your family.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Haave, thank you very much for your kind message and then contribution to this special lecture tour in Hiroshima universities.
オルター先生、どうもありがとうございました。では引き続きまして、越智学長から特別栄誉称号および感謝状の贈呈を行いたいと思います。
ご参加の皆様、オルター博士のご講演を楽しんでいただけましたでしょうか。医学の進展に大きく寄与されたことから、昨年ノーベル賞を受賞されましたオルター博士に、この度広島大学特別栄誉教授を授与させていただきました。ここで特別栄誉教授記を読み上げたいと思います。特別栄誉教授記、ハーベイ・オルター殿、あなたは極めて顕著な功績を挙げ、音楽における教育研究の進展に寄与したので、広島大学特別栄誉教授の称号を授与します。令和3年9月25日、広島大学長、越智光雄。オルター博士には、称号立てと記念品の和傘をお送りいたしました。オルター博士、ありがとうございました。この後、オルター博士が称号立てを受け取られた映像を流しますので、ご覧になってください。
はい。越智学長より特別栄誉教授の称号と記念の日本の和傘をオルター博士にお送りしております。今おっしゃいましたように、オルター博士からコメントいただいておりますので、よろしくお願いします。
It was a beautiful, first of all, this was totally unexpected. I received this beautiful plaque that they said I was honorary professor at Hiroshima University, Dr. Ochi, and it was a total surprise, a great honor, great privilege to receive that. I'm very, very appreciative. In addition, the university sent my wife a parasol. That was the most beautiful I've ever seen. It was so magnificent. We're trying to find a place to hang it up as an ornament in the house rather than use it as a parasol. It's absolutely gorgeous. So I thank you for that as well. Been a great privilege. If you want, I can go get the plaque. Take me just a minute. You want to wait for that or not?
Yes, we can wait a bit.
Yeah,
if possible.
If
Thank
possible,
you
you
very
have.
much. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much.
素晴らしい。
So first of all,
Yeah.
they came in this beautiful wooden box.
Ah,
And then
right.
inside,
Oh,
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Happy,
Yeah.
for your
it's
kindness.
a treasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, now time at the closing time is approaching. Thank you very much, Harvey, for your wonderful cooperation to this lecture tour in the Hiroshima University. Finally, I would like to thank again to joining us today for you to this early in the morning. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I really
very
enjoyed
much.
talking with you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
はい、ありがとうございました。それではここでライブ視聴者からの質疑応答に移りたいと思います。座長は本学副学長理事の阿部学が務めます。阿部先生、ではここからよろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。座長の阿部です。よろしくお願いします。それではこれから視聴者の皆様からですね、質問をお受けしたいと思います。オルター博士に代わりまして、我々が回答をいたします。なお、質問は Zoom 参加者からのみとさせていただきます。質問がある場合はですね、Zoom 画面内の手を挙げるボタンを押してください。質問者はこちらから指名をいたしますので、指名された方は画面に表示されるパネリストとして参加を押してください。音声をオンにして、ビデオ表示可能な方はビデオをオンにしていただければと思います。まず、所属とお名前をおっしゃった後ですね、質問をお願いします。質問は1分以内をめどに行ってください。時間の関係で途中で質問を中断させていただく場合もありますので、ご了承いただければと思います。いかがでしょうか。どなたか質問ございますでしょうか。画面の下のところにですね、質問のある方は手を挙げるのサインをしていただければと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。ご遠慮なくどうぞ。高校生の方もいらっしゃるようですので、質問等ありましたらぜひよろしくお願いします。いかがでしょうか。それでは、チャットの方ですかね。チャットの方に、英語で、質問が入っていますけども、少し私の方からご紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。で、ご回答はそうですね、横断先生の方で、できる範囲でお願いしたいと思います。質問、チャットの方ですね、セパナ・ファーマさんってお読みするんでしょうか、から質問をいただいています。ドクター・ハーベイ先生の質問ですけども、多分、What is the best strategy to control HCV infection leading to liver cirrhosis in developing countries where it remains a huge problem? So this is a very important question from the audience. So can Dr. Odan have some comments on these questions?
Yes, if I am Dr. Alder, I will answer this way. At the Q&A session, Dr. Alder said that there's no elevator to success. And he also said that if you do the clinical research, you will not have rapid answers. So I think you should not give up the problem you faced. And I know DAA treatment is a very powerful treatment cures many people and probably completely cure HCV. But because of financial problem, this therapy would not be spread in the developing countries. But education, development education, and probably social system will be very important. And I think epidemiology is also very important. And again, step by step will be the very key, a very good word for you. Could I answer for you, Dr. Balma?
小田先生、ありがとうございます。So, Dr. Balma, it's okay for you? Okay, thank you very much. それでは他にですね、何かご質問と非常に基本的な内容でも結構ですので、ご質問をいただけたらと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。ご質問がある場合はですね、手を挙げていただければ、こちらの方で質問者に対してアサインをしますので、ご遠慮なくいかがでしょう。よろしいでしょうか。はい。それではですね、質問がないようですので、これでですね、質疑応答は終了とさせていただきたいと思います。ありがとうございました。はい。それでは田中先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
安倍先生、どうもありがとうございました。それではとても胸を打つオルタ先生のお話だったと思いますけれども。
先生、すいません。はい、なんか今、チャットで追加の質問が入りました。大田先生、すみません。DAA の治療は1回いくらかかるのでしょうか。
これ1回の治療じゃないんですよね。
なるほど。
1回で治るというよりは何週間か投与してウイルスが消えるまで、消えなければまた続けてなってですね。でその薬にもよって値段は違うんですけど、今ある薬の中で高価なのは確かなんですね。で、それは日本においても医療経済上圧迫するほどの金額ではあることは間違いないんですが、それがなおのこと、デベロッピングカントリーではなおのことそうであって、分かって、これが効くことは分かっていても、人々に届かない国々もあるというところからこういう質問があるんだと思います。すみません、この薬がいくら、この薬がいくらっていうふうにはちょっと私も記憶してないので申し訳ありません。
はい、ありがとうございました。他、よろしいでしょうか。今、ありがとうございましたというチャットが入りましたので、ありがとうございます。それでは、田中先生、すみません。
じゃあ、もう一人あるようですよ。
もう一人。はい。広島市民病院研修医1年の、はい。どうぞ、ご質問あれば、チャットでもいいですし、手を挙げていただければ、口頭でご質問いただけると思いますが、いかがでしょう。日野井さんでしょうか。手を挙げるのが難しいようでしたら、チャットでも、ありがとうございます。田中先生、大田先生は、ご自身の研究のターニングポイントっていうのはありましたでしょうか。田中先生、どうですか。ご自身のキャリアで、何か今、そうですね、何か。
そうですね。
そう
ですね。私、一番最初研究を始めた20代の頃は、まだ C 型肝炎ウイルスは見つかっていなくて、ウイルス肝炎のことも知らなかったんですけれども、ちょうど1989年の C 型肝炎ウイルスがまさにオルタ先生たちがクローニングされて 見つけた年にちょうど私の前任のウイルス肝炎をやってる先生が教授として赴任されて、それで私はウイルス肝炎の研究を始めることになったということで、それからもう30何年ですけれども、それがターニングポイントといえば、肝炎ウイルスとの出会いということで、それをずっとやってきています。そういう意味でとてもC 型肝炎ウイルスの見つかった最初の時から今撲滅ができるかどうかというようなところまで付き合ってきているという点では思い入れのある疾患です。
はい。ありがとうございます。大田先生。
はい。ターニングポイントというよりは、私の場合は、臨床で出会った患者さん、残念ながら、治癒に至るのに、手助けできなかった患者さんに出会うごとに、次の患者さんにはより良い医療を提供したいというところから、研究をということを思い続けておりますので、研究の面でターニングポイントっていうよりも、課題が常に日常医療の場にありますので、それを解決することに追われているという感じですね。うまくいかないことばかりで、むしろうまくいかないことの方が多いんですけど、でもそれでもオルター先生の教えのように諦めないということが大事かと思ってます。
オルター先生もおっしゃいましたけど、何かするためにこうするっていうよりも、いつも一生懸命何かを新しいことを見つけようとか、これをどうにかやって作り出そうとかいう気持ちが大事というような話をされて、とても共感する面があったなと思いましたけど。
そうですね。これどなたがおっしゃったかあれですけど、教育とは、なんか生命の危機に至らない程度の失敗を繰り返してすることとかさせることとかっていうことって言われますけど、失敗がすなわち次のステップに行けるってことからすると、ターニングポイントが感じる時が成長の時なんじゃないですかね。
そうですね。はい。ありがとうございます。チャットだと割と皆さんたくさんご質問いただけるようで、内藤さんからご質問をいただいています。先生方はウイルスは悪者だとお考えでしょうか。またどのような意図でウイルスをご研究なされているのでしょうか、というご質問ですけども、まずウイルスは悪者でしょうか。
どうでしょう。ウイルスをずっと、C 型肝炎とか B 型肝炎、肝炎ウイルスです。今はコロナウイルスですけど、見ていると、本当に知恵があるのじゃないかというぐらい、いろんな変異を繰り返しながら人類と共存してきているのを見るので、違いに悪いということは言えないし、大田先生、免疫系のこともありますから、お互いの干渉で共存するということもあってもいいのかなと思うので、一概に悪者だというふうには私は思っていませんけ
ど。はい。小田先生、いかがですか。難しい質問。
そうですね。これ大変難しい質問で、
進化には必要です
よね。
そうですね。我々の進化にもしかしたら
共存
何一つ無駄なことは私たちは経験していないとすると、進化のために必要かもしれませんけど、でも直面する問題とすると悪者ですよね。
集団として長い目で見ると、
はい、
そういうポジティブな意見も出ますけど、個人として
そうですね。何とか抑え込みたいなと思いました。私の場合は移植を専門としているので、B 型肝炎、C 型肝炎で肝不全になられて移植をして、せっかく臓器が取り替わって元気になりかけた頃にウイルスが再発するって、これほど憎いものはないですね。ところがC 型肝炎というのがウイルスが同定されて薬もできて、再発率が極端に下がって元気になられる方、 悪いウイルスを乗り越えるということは、とても素晴らしいことだと思いますけど、私たちの進化の過程でどういう意味があるかというのは、このご質問いただいた中学生の内藤先生あたり、内藤さんあたりが解明してくれるんじゃないでしょうか。
この C 型肝ウイルスの薬が出て、本当に肝がんの原因の大きな割合を占めていた C 型肝ウイルスの感染が減って、肝がん死亡が減っているのを数字で見ると、本当にそれも30年足らずでということになると素晴らしいなというふうに思います。
30年。短いようで長い。
短いです。長いです。いや、でもポリオとかですね、とてもエジプトの時代からもう人類が向き合っているものがあって、まだ根絶できていないということを思うと、とても30数年でエリミネーションの一つの疾病になるっていうのは、まあ、驚異的なことかなと思います。
今のCOVID に対する治療薬とかですねっていうのも出るのが、今ワクチンでなんとかっていうことなんです。かからないようにするっていうのが一つの手なんだと思うんですけどね。将来的にはやっぱり治療薬っていうかですね、特効薬みたいなのが出てくれば、かなり世の中も変わってくるかなと思うんですよね。タキソールです。タキソールじゃないな。なんだっけ。インフルエンザの薬。
タミフル。
タミフル。ごめんなさい。
のような感じ。
タミフルのような感じのものが出てくれば、かなり変わってくるかなっていうことですかね。
そうですね。
はい。はい。ありがとうございます。それではですね、はい。手が上がってますか。はい。在間さんでしょうか。パネリストとして参加をするという形で入っていただけましたでしょうか。在間さんでよろしかったですかね、お名前は、読み方は。
よろしいです。
はい。
はい、
どうぞ。
よろしいですか。
はい。
お願いします。私は広島大学の文学研究科の学生なんですけど、私は日本史について研究をしているんですが、私の場合は短期間に資料を見つけて発見をすることができるんですけど、先生方の研究というのは10年、20年、ほとんど気の遠くなるような研究を続けてこられて、たくさんの失敗をされた中で、一つ新しい発見ができれば、それが大きな成果になると思うんですが、その何年も何十年も研究を続けていかれる、そのモチベーションというのは何なのかお聞かせいただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。モチベーションですね。田中先生どうですか。
本当に単純な子供っぽいことですけど、知らないことを知りたいというね。知る。誰もわからないことを明らかにする、ということに対しても非常に強い好奇心が小さい頃からあって、それが題材を変えながら、私はウイルス肝炎を、どのように広がって、どのようにプリベンションしていけばいいかというのが、地域レベル、日本レベル、世界レベルでっていうのが面白いと思って、そのモチベーションを持っている。それなぜかと言われるとちょっとわからないんですけど、好奇心が強いのかもしれない。
好奇心が
大事。とか、オーバーカムすることが強いのかもしれない。
ハーヴェイ先生もそうおっしゃってましたね。好奇心が大事で、決して私はノーベル賞を取ろうと思ったんではないと。ただ、天才でもなかったと。ただ知りたいというですね、そこら辺のことをですね、しっかり地道にやってきたっていう話がありましたよね。
私はおっしゃるように、これが大きな発見なんだとか、そういう成果は10年に1つとか、そんな感じなんですね。でも失敗の連続でも、その失敗の中でも次の足がかりになるような失敗もありますので、それに喜びを感じて、この道は違ったんだということを知ったんだっていう、それに喜びを感じながら、前には進んでいるなっていうのを共同研究者と分かち合いながら進んでいると、それほど苦しくはないというふうに思っています。でも貴重なご質問ありがとうございます。
はい、ありがとうございま
安
した。
倍先生もぜひ聞きたいですね。
安倍先生はい
私ですか
かがですか？
私も好奇心ですね。好奇心と何か知りたいという素朴な疑問ですよね。何か知りたいというあたりですね。はい。ありがとうございます。
はい、ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
そろそろ時間なんですけど、はい。
共鳴できるところもありますので、私自身の研究にも先生方おっしゃってくださったことを生かしていきたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。そろそろ時間なんですけど、
はい、
高校生からですね、先生、すみません、最後の質問でさせていただきたいと思います。高校生の2年の原田さんからご質問をいただいてます。COVID-19 ですね、の感染拡大は研究者の方々の活動の妨げになっているのでしょうか。研究物質の運搬や共同研究など、また今後も収束しない場合、その状況はどのように改善されていくというふうにお考えですかというご質問ですね。どうでしょう、先生方、研究で、COVID-19 の感染拡大、広島大学、最初の去年ですかね。
はい、
一番最初の頃はキャンパスへの立ち入りもかなり制限をした。あの時は結構研究全部ストップしてましたですね。で、先生方病院でお勤めの時っていうのは患者さんは待ってくれませんからね。そういうところでのお仕事はあったとは思うんですけども、研究面という意味でいかがでしたかね。
私はそうですね、疫学やっているので、国際調査もやっているので、外国に行けなくなったということで、その調査がどうなるかなということで、高校の2年の原田君の質問ですけど、そういう意味では、活動の妨げには一時期はなりましたけど、人間ってやはりそういう困難が出てくると、それをなんとか乗り換える方法を工夫して考えるんだと思うんですね。それで私はもう外国の調査2つやってるんですけど、行かないまま現地の人もやはりしっかりウェブで準備して話をして、調査を継続したりしていますし、国内の研究もなんとかできる範囲内のことで工夫してアレンジしながらやっているということで、別のその能力も見出したりしてですね、妨げになっていることは確かですけど、それ以外のことで新たなものを見つけたり、新たな方法とか調査法とかミーティングの仕方とかいろんなものを見つけられたという意味ではいい機会になったのかなというふうにも思うし、そう思って進まざるを得ないというか、進んでいく。
そういうところありますよね。確かに
どうですか？どうでしょう。
ちょっと難しい場面なんかは、今みたいにね、こういうウェブで何でもできるようになったりとか、あと遠隔操作とかですね、そういう技術っていうのは今まで、必要だろうと思われてたけども、実際にこういう状況になってみないと、やっぱりちゃんと動かないっていうことはありますので。
確かに妨げになっているので、早く正常化にはなった方がいいと思いますけど、正常化された時にはまた新たなものが付け加わった、
そうですよね。
新たな時代になるのではないかなと思いますけど、先生、診療とか、治療とか患者さんの方で。
診療面も、やはりコロナ感染者の方を最優先にするようになるので、日常診療に影響が出ている病院もありますけど、それすぐに役割分担して、COVID を見る病院とそうでない病院に、やっぱりシステムを作ったり、こういう時の連帯感って、ヒューマンならではじゃないかなと思いますね。これ原田君ですかね、大変鋭い指摘ですよね。こういう状況で私たちが団結しないといけない。それができなければウイルスの変異に負けて、私たちも変異をしなければいけないんですけど、それがとても大事でありますし、人類はそれがあるから生き延びてきてるんじゃないかなと思います。こういうウェブでの会議って、こんな短期間で普及すると思わなかったですよね。
そうですよね。
すごい勢いで普及しましたし、こういうことが続けられている限りは、ウイルスには負けないんじゃないかなというふうに思います。
はい、ありがとうございます。 はい。それではですね、そろそろたくさんまだご質問があろうかとは思うんですけども、質問をこれで、終了にさせていただきたいと思います。
安倍先生、どうもありがとうございました。小名先生、ありがとうございました。それでは、お時間になりましたので、安倍理事より閉会の挨拶をお願いしたいと思います。
はい。改めまして、広島大学学術社会連携担当理事副学長の安倍でございます。今日は休日にもかかわらず、たくさんの方にご参加いただきましたことを誠にありがたく感謝申し上げます。ありがとうございます。また、このように大変有意義な講演会を開催することができましたのは、オルター先生がご多忙の中、ご講演のお願いを快くお聞き受けいただいたからだと思います。オルター先生の多大なご理解とですね、ご協力に改めて心よりお礼を申し上げます。感謝申し上げます。さて、本日のご講演及び座談会はいかがでしたでしょうか。本日は本学の研究者や大学生だけでなく、一般の方や高校生の皆さんにもご参加いただいております。普段研究者の話を聞くことのない高校生の皆さんにとって、ノーベル賞受賞者の先生の話を聞くことができた本日の講演会は一生の宝物になったのではないかと思います。オルター先生の研究に対する熱い思いとですね、若い研究者皆様へのメッセージをお感じいただけたというふうに思います。オルター先生、講演の中で最後の方におっしゃっていましたけども、何か新しいことを見つけるためにはですね、エレベーターはないんだということでした。地道にですね、真摯に物語に取り組むということがやはり大事であろうというふうに思います。こういうことをですね、皆様も私も含めて改めて学んだものと思います。皆さんの中でですね、未来の研究者を目指したいと思われた方がですね、こういう機会を通じて一人でもいてくだされば大変我々は嬉しく思いますし、それ以外の道に進まれたとしましてもですね、本日のお話が何かしら参考になればというふうに思っております。最後に、オルター先生のますますのご活躍とご多幸、そして本講演会にご参加の皆様のご健勝を心からお祈り申し上げまして、簡単ではございますけども、閉会の挨拶に変えさせていただきます。本日はどうもありがとうございました。
では、以上で広島大学知のフォーラム、広島大学から世界へ、世界のトップ研究者に聞く第5弾を終了いたします。ご参加の皆様、お忙しい中、ありがとうございました。遠くアメリカからご参加いただいたオルタ博士にも感謝申し上げます。それでは皆さん、次の知のフォーラムでお会いしたいと思います。